thank you very much for choosing to have a dialogue on this very important topic. I split my time between Odisha and Delhi these days. I have been here now for the past 2 weeks, and every day I look up the newspaper and I read the headlines about concerns around school reopening. And I see in a metropolis like Delhi, the concerns center around, how safe the children going to be uh, from COVID. And then the other concern that kind of pops up is around mental health illness. Very little you get to read in the newspaper here about what we say, the triple whammy that our children have had to face through the pandemic, and the third leg of that, which is nutritional losses. Uh, I'm therefore thankful to you to have chosen to discuss the issue, because I think this issue needs to be center staged. Center staged primarily because the kind of numbers that some of our previous speakers have brought up, and some of the reports that have come out recently, mostly you see them coming from international agencies, and there are a few Indian agencies also have come up with reports, but I think firm data is yet to be compiled, and I'm pretty sure when they do get compiled, we would get to learn of a reality that is actually much more worse than what has been feared in reports that have been published so far. Very recently, I am associated with an organization called Forum for Odisha Dialogues, which is also a thought leadership forum. And Dr. Vandana Prasad was there recently. We had picked up this topic of reopening of Anganwadis and resuming ICDS programs. And some statistics got shared there, which were actually a survey done by the Regional Medical Research Center there, which is a government outfit. And some statistics thrown there kind of corroborate what Vandana earlier mentioned. We had in that report, and that was based on a survey between March and August, that there was a 18% fall in immunization in Odisha during that period, during the pandemic phase. And mind you, in the first wave, Odisha was much less affected than most other states. Despite that, there was an 18% fall in immunization. There was a 9 to 18% fall rise in acute illness among children. And there was a 7% increase in malnutrition. And I want to reiterate the fact that Odisha was seen as a state which was probably amongst the least affected during the first wave of the pandemic. This kind of supports what Vandana mentioned about the UN report that kind of projects 10 to 12% increase in malnutrition, which, as the UN reports have cited, may increase as the pandemic prolongs, and we still do not know the full enormity of it. We have yet to experience. I was actually alarmed by the statistics Vandana shared from that report, which actually works out to the children deaths, 6,000 daily deaths, actually works out to almost 2 million additional child mortality. It's not 2 lakhs; it is 2 million actually. If I got my maths right, and that's alarming. If 39 billion meals missed is the statistic that UN has put out for 2020, and if one were to safely take a ballpark estimate of 25%, a quarter of that being in India, that would mean anything upward of 30 million children have missed midday meal scheme. Now, we know that there have been attempts to substitute that with dry ration supply and all, but we also know that the dry ration supply thing has not been a real answer to the problem, because there are various issues about targeting them, about how inaccessible demographies have not been reached, and how at a broader level there has been much less provisioning for dry ration than what would have been the case with midday meal scheme. And more importantly, there is the issue of intra-family distribution that came up during the panel discussion, and which is a reality to face with, that this dry ration made their way to family homes, which had seen significant income losses and significant shortfall in availability of food at a household level. So there are consequences of that. I benefited from what Vinita had to say about one takeaway from there in terms of way forward was that lots of reforms are still possible at a state level, and instead of waiting for any grand plan at a national level, states should take up how at their own level they can intervene and find ways out of this before it gets worse. Now, a few words of caution. There is a lot of talk that is happening now about, I'll kind of come to the bigger issue, whether we take refuge under fortified rice, or whether we talk about social protection programs, the context-specific food security interventions that Kavita mentioned about. I want to now kind of take this debate a little out of the narrow channel of nutritional security among children being seen as a challenge that can be remedied only through social protection or what we call social security support schemes. The question that I want to raise, can you really look at, given the enormity of this challenge, and we know what kind of impact it's going to have on intergenerational inequity. You also shared statistics about stunting, wasting. Those numbers are only going to get worse. Can we look at nutritional security in isolation from the larger political economy of food security? Now, there are some serious concerns cropping up there. What actually determines food security? And I think this is the best time. I was thinking about your topic yesterday, and the book that came to my mind, I just pulled it out from my shelf. It's a little jaded, old now, Hunger and Public Action. The seminal work by Zondres and Amartya Sen. I think there cannot be a better time to revisit this work. I kind of glanced through it, and I just related that all the concerns that was being talked about, this was a 1989 publication, how they have come to life again after nearly 30 decades. In these 30 decades, we made a lot of progress, and we made a lot of progress because of both what one could call growth-mediated protection and social security or support-mediated protection. Government providing a lot of entitlements, largely the state providing a lot of entitlements, and the general economic upliftment and economic boom that we saw starting somewhere from the mid-90s, with a little pause in between and then again resuming in the first decade of the millennium. Now, this entire reversal of the progress done on the hunger front from 2014 onward has been largely attributed to economic slowdowns and economic downturns. Climate extremes, conflicts have also been cited as other reasons, but primarily it is the took away the growth-mediated improvement in food security that you saw in the 2 decades preceding that. And this was happening already before the pandemic hit us. Now, and also an economic downturn and economic slowdown also shrinks the capability of a state to intervene, both in terms of resources and in terms of prioritization of welfare measures. And we also saw that happening, particularly in the Indian context, it is important to note that while we talk about various interventions, efforts such as Poshan and all that, a lot of renaming and remerging of and recrashioning of schemes have happened. But the reality is that the Indian government started spending less and less and less from 2013 onward. Each year, it has spent less and less and less on all of such programs that were intended to improve food security, that were intended to counter malnutrition, that were intended to counter undernourishment. That's the reality. And we need to confront that. So we need to understand the political economy of it, that we went through a phase where there was a retreat of the state. And that retreat of the state was actually going to prove very expensive and destructive to the gains actually we had achieved on this front. Okay. Now, I have 5 more minutes, Anil?
Yeah. Please.
Okay. Because I need to explain this. So now, when the pandemic hit, what happened? Now, we have studied in our classic literature that a food crisis occurs when access to food goes away. When, if you were to borrow the old classical example, when people lose purchasing power to buy food. Now, people would lose purchasing power to buy food if there is a loss of income, or if there is a significant spike in retail food inflation that makes their access to food no longer there. Or you could use a term, collapse of exchange entitlement, which is a market-driven entitlement that someone like Amartya Sen would try to use. That when there is a collapse of exchange entitlement that happens, you end up in a situation of a food crisis. And that's exactly what happened with this unmindful lockdown that was announced in the month of March, April. There was a sudden loss of income for millions of families. And we did have a huge crisis. 6 months down the line, when certain organizations brought out a report called Hunger Watch, it demonstrated that 2/3 of the marginalized population in our urban centers reported that they got to eat less or somewhat less or significantly less from what they were eating earlier. It also turned out that urban hunger, incidence of urban hunger, was 15 percentage points more than rural hunger. At Odisha Dialogues, during this period, we conducted a survey in 8 blocks of southwestern Odisha, in Kalahandi, Koraput, and Balangir. And we found that as part of coping strategies of returning migrants, that's what we were trying to study. And we found that most returning migrants reported that they were cutting on their food intake in order to cope with the loss of income that they have had, right? So there is the exchange entitlement, market entitled exchange entitlement. There has been a collapse or destruction of that has happened. 2, the state provided entitlements, direct and indirect, that support food security. Things like ICDS, things like an efficient PDS. Although an effort was made to allocate more, your food subsidy bill went up by almost 100% in 2021, but that was still not enough to offset the impact of the income losses that a lot of marginalized families had to cope with because of the lockdown and the economic slowdown. So then you had the school closure, you have talked about it. Then the indirect support, things what Kavita mentioned about access to healthcare, whether it is your vaccination program, whether it is safe drinking water, whether even in urban center for children, a play field for a place for physical activity. You have ended up with problems of obesity in other places, right? So all of these things, the absence or withdrawal of state-supported entitlement caused an issue. So now, therefore, the question to ask is, can you really talk about nutritional security without paying attention or without taking note of what is really happening to food security at a broader level? And this is what the state today is, that the food security situation in India has gotten severely worse. It is much less reported now. It is really, I mean, in the early months of the lockdown, there was a starvation death in Odisha. Not a single media outlet first took it up. Afterwards, a few took it up, but there was no hue and cry. But we visited that place. We visited that lady, Dukhi Jani, a tribal woman who died simply because she was a single woman and there was no support. And she just fell, dropped dead one day because she was going hungry. Okay? And yet, it was not registered as a starvation death. So you will not hear these reports, but they will keep coming up. Now, what are my concerns and why I'm saying that this discourse has to be linked with a wider discourse on food security is because of this. There are a few other developments that have happened during the pandemic, which is, we think the corporatization and commercialization of agriculture has been pushed big time. Now, that has got its implications for food security. And why do I say so? Because food security, to begin with, we need to have food self-sufficiency. Now, I do not know if you are aware of this fact. It is only in 1992 India attained food self-sufficiency in the truest sense, meaning it started producing enough food grains that were enough to meet the nutritional requirements defined our poverty by our poverty line. It was only in 1992 we reached that state. Okay, and of course, after that, we have done reasonably well on the food grain production front. We have reached record production of 297 million tons. Yet we still cannot ensure that every household gets enough for the food grain that it needs. Food self-sufficiency is the first condition. The kind of policy changes that are happening now in the agriculture space, the fact that for many, many years we are really not making any major breakthrough with productivity relating to major crops are certain sources of concern. We might be doing fine now, but in the longer run, there are concerns. Now, does food self-sufficiency mean you will be food secure? No. First, you have to have food self-sufficiency. That has to translate into availability of food. When you talk about availability of food, then you talk about access to food. Now, availability of food or access to food, inter alia, in an agriculturally small agriculture dominant country like India, is decided by how you produce that food. Who produce? When a farmer produces that food, how much of that food actually he's going to own? If he has to consume it for himself. The kind of tendencies, policy changes that we are now seeing under the, pretext of the new farm laws, the commercialization, corporatization, there are some serious threats that are looming large for small agriculture, food security among families that are dependent on such small agriculture. So that's the other thing. Now, the last point that I would like to flag, that we cannot take our eyes off, is what is happening to retail food inflation. Now, retail food inflation, by all statistical agencies monitoring prices today in the country, is grossly underestimated. There has been a significant spike in retail food inflation, and through the pandemic years, that has exacerbated more than before. And there are concerns that some of these inflationary breaks that we have seen might actually be structural in nature, in the sense they might not go back to the previous levels. And this spike in retail food inflation is actually making food inaccessible to a lot of people, let alone nutritious diet, which is no longer accessible to a large population in the country. So we need to bear these things in mind, and we need to come to a state where we call the spade a spade and say, look, we need to address these very fundamental and basic questions before we can go over to specific program-based interventions. Thank you very much.